What I want to do is share with you some of the experiences we've had in a program called Grain and Graze. It hasn't had the same prominence in the north as it has in the south and the west of the country. But Grain and Graze is a mixed farming program, and the issue that we faced in mixed farming was how do you combine most effectively livestock and cropping? How do you get that balance right? How do you get that sort of rotation right between the two? And so it became an issue that we found was really very complex, and there was a hell of a lot of things behind it in what decision you made and how you got that balance right. So that was the background of where all this work's come from over the last 8 or 9 years. And so I just want to share with you some of what I see the key points that have come out of it, and I'll try and tie that in with some of the comments Jeff made around the weed stuff, because the place where I come from, southwest Victoria, I'm based in Geelong, southwest Victoria. 20 years ago, you wouldn't find a crop in southwest Victoria. Now about 20% of all the landscape is in cropping. It's the biggest land use change since European settlement. And we've got some massive weed resistance problems created in 15 years, particularly with wild radish and annual ryegrass. So, decision making around that, I'll tie in with some of Jeff's stuff. First point, what influences a decision? I reckon there are 3 centres or 3 influences. First one is the head. And that's the logical side of things. And a lot of information and a lot of stuff that we talk to people about and we present to people is what I'd call the logical stuff. You know, it's the results, it's the information that we've got. It's the, if you don't do this, this will happen type stuff. Okay? That's the rational type stuff. And I'm not going to touch on that anymore in this talk, because for the next day and a half, this is what you're going to get a lot of the rational, logical, information type stuff. I want to focus on 2 other things. I want to focus on what I call the heart. So we've got the head, we've also got the heart. Okay? This is the emotional side of it. And just, if I can implore with you, that one thing you get in agriculture is people carry a lot of emotion with them. Okay? And a lot of their decisions are influenced by emotion, by their beliefs, by their values, by their preferences. Okay? It's what actually drives their decision, not the logic, it's the heart. And the third one I want to touch on is what I call the gut, or the intuition. And farmers operate with a lot of intuition. They operate with a lot of gut feel. Okay? So, first point to take away, we've got these 3 centres, the head, the heart and the gut. And I want to look at the heart and the gut side of it in a bit more detail. Second point I want to raise is about the type of decision we've got to deal with. And I split these up fairly simply into 3. We've got simple decisions, where there are a few issues, there's a logical approach to it, and there's information available. Got this weed, need to control this weed, there's a chemical out there I can use, what does the label tell me, what do the recommendations tell me, that's what I go and do. Okay. Sometimes they become more complicated, so simple decisions become more complicated, where there are more issues that we've got to deal with, but generally you can work through those decisions. And quite often we have decision support tools. We have models, or I'm sure most people out there will have the Excel spreadsheets made up to help them calculate and work out things or work through things. And generally there's a right answer. You can come to a conclusion, you can come to a point where you say, that's what we should do. Third one that I want to touch on though is what I call the complex. And I reckon if you've been sitting there and listening to Jeff's talk, all that came across to me all the time is we are now dealing with a very complex issue. Weed resistance, weed management is a complex farming issue, okay? Where there are many issues, and quite often you can't compare one to the other. Can't do a gross margin of this, compare it to a gross margin of that, because there are other things that come into play. Quite often they involve other people who have got to make that decision or influence the result of that. And there can be many different ways that you can get to an end point, okay, before you make a decision. And I'd just say to you, a lot of decisions we have in farming are complex, and we deal a lot of decisions thinking they're complicated and there's a right answer. I'd suggest to you that in a lot of cases, there isn't. We are dealing with complex issues, and we've got to get our heads around what that means and how you deal with them. So, point of those 2 comments is that as a decision moves and becomes more complex, the gut and the heart have an increase in the decision making. So it moves away from the logical. This makes sense, you know, if you don't do this, the weeds are going to build up to this, and that's the logical side of it, okay? What we're really dealing with here is the heart the emotional side of it, and the gut, which is the intuitive side of it, which is influence the decision a farmer will actually end up making. Now, just to follow through on a couple of points around the gut side of it. One thing we've got to do in decision making, and farming is no different to this, is that you've got to make timely decisions. If we hang off too long, waiting and analysing, we never get to a point where we actually make a decision in a timely fashion. And quite often we've got to do it with limited information. We can't research everything and find out everything. Okay, and I've got there, you can't know everything. So somehow we've got to come to a point of making a decision in a timely fashion with limited information. And there are two things that drive this timely decision making. One is intuition. Everybody in this room's got intuition. And the important thing about intuition, and the reason why I'm mentioning it, is that it bypasses that rational process, the logical working through the decision. So it speeds up your decision. Okay? Intuitively, I think this. My gut tells me this. I go and do that, okay, without working through it. It's formed primarily through experience, both good and bad experiences. Develop your intuition. It builds over time, so obviously the more you do, the more you experience, the more you see, the more your intuitive capacity grows. But importantly, the quality of that experience determines how valuable your intuition is. So if you've seen lots of different things, in a sense you know more, you've experienced more, you've got more intuition. Okay, the second one, so intuition's one. The second one that we use a lot are rules of thumb. Okay, what's a rule of thumb? It's simply a mental shortcut so that you can make a decision quickly. So on one hand, we've got intuition. The other thing that helps drive these timely decisions is these rules of thumb, and they speed up that decision making. And they're the starting point for making a decision. In a sense, we don't think about it, we start from here. Okay? Everybody in this room will be operating under rules of thumb. You'll be advising your clients based on rules of thumb. In a lot of cases, you don't know that you're actually doing it, because very often they're used unconsciously. Okay? The important thing of separating what I've done here between rules of thumb and intuition is that rules of thumb can be learnt. They can be taught, they can be transferred, they can be handed down. I've got a lot of rules of thumb that I carry around as a consultant that I learnt from experienced consultants 20, 30 years ago when I was starting out. Okay, so they get passed from one to the other. Intuition can't be. Intuition is what you see yourself and what you experience yourself. But the important message out of this is take home, we've got two things operating, these rules of thumb and this intuition that helps us make timely decisions when we can't do that logical, rational head analysis because we don't have time and we don't have all the information. A few example rules of thumb I'll just click up here and let you read through. Okay, things like, what's a rule of thumb? We ran a series of workshops in the West and the South. One of the consultants in Western Australia said, my rule of thumb is I sell a third of the grain at sowing, a third later in the season, a third at harvest. That's the rule of thumb that guides their decision making and their marketing. If it's $300, I'll sell because that $300 is a good price for wheat. Or this one that I like from Lynn Sykes, if you can see your mother-in-law's underwear on a clothesline, your houses are too close. Okay? That's a social one about we're too close together in a farming business as a farming family. And we need a bit more space. Now, potential trap with rules of thumb is that we rely on them when circumstances have changed or things are different. So while they're really, really useful as long as they remain valid for the situation you're dealing with, if circumstances have changed and you keep using those same rules of thumb, they can actually lead you in the wrong direction. And in your notes, I haven't got time to go through this, there's what we've called a simple 5-question technique to unpack those rules of thumb. So I'd urge you all, when you head home either tonight or tomorrow night and driving, think about some of the rules of thumb around sowing that's going to come up, or seeding in the next couple of months. What are those rules? And try and get a bit of a handle on how you can unpack those to check whether they're still valid given the circumstances we currently face. Okay, I'll leave that there. Another thing that I'll touch on very briefly that's so important in decision making is risk. Okay? And we all talk about risk and we all intuitively sort of think that's a risky decision or it's not as risky. I've done a fair bit of work on risk in the last 5 or 6 years, particularly trying to take risk from the gut feel intuitive and put it into the logical or the rational, so trying to put some numbers around it. But a few important points I just want to cover. First of all, risk is derived from the Italian word called risicare, which means to dare. If most people think about risk, I reckon you think of the downside. What happens when things go wrong, when things stuff up, when things go bad? Risk has also got an upside as well. And if I take a punt on that, what's the potential return? And so what you're trading off is risk for reward. Okay, and there's no reward without risk. So when we start talking about risk, not only think about the downside of it, but also think of the potential or the upside of it. Risk lies in the extremes. And I've heard a lot of people talk about risk and then talk about the average. Okay, there's no risk in the average. If we got average yields and average prices every year, and we could consistently get that year after year, there is no risk. So if you're talking to your clients and trying to talk about risk and you keep presenting average figures, average yield by average price, you're not talking about risk. You're simply not talking about risk. So I said averages don't convey risk. Okay. A couple of things from a personal point of view is that risk is personal. Two people confronted with exactly the same situation, one might find it too risky, another person doesn't. There's no right or wrong position on risk. It's what an individual is prepared to live with. Also recognise that risk will change through your life, through circumstances, experiences you've had, events that have gone on. So this idea about I have a certain position on risk, that can change overnight, can change over 12 months. Importantly, risk resides mainly in the intuitive, which is in the gut feel. Okay, so when people are talking about risk, I've found that most people, it's in my guts, you know, and they look at a scenario or a situation and go, oh, I don't know, it doesn't sit right with me, something a bit risky about it. Okay, so if we're recognising if we want to talk about decision making and we talk about risk, which is an important part of it, then it's going to sit in the intuitive. So you've got to understand how people's intuitive decision making operates. A couple of other things quickly with risk. If you want to talk about risk, you've got what I call frame the odds, because risk is about likelihood by consequence, or what's the probability of this result occurring or that result occurring. And if you want to frame the odds and start to think about the odds, we can use what I call form guides. And if you think of racing, you look at racing and you think there are odds on this horse winning or this dog winning or whatever else, and they have different odds because there's different probability that people reckon it's going to win. You can look back historically and find out how that dog or that horse has run under different conditions. That's what I call my form guides. And I've put 4 points up here. One that's just about ready to be released is a historic price guide. So we can go back and look at the historic prices on a whole lot of commodities over certain periods of time to start to understand the odds of how often am I going to get that price, or how often historically have I got that price. We could do the same for yield. And the fellas right up the back on my right-hand side with the OFT, the on-farm trials, is where we're putting, and the GRDC are funding this, trials from a whole lot of grower groups all around the country, anything up to the last 20 years, where you can actually go online and start to extract the information you want to understand about some of the yield data that might be there, historic yield data under different trial conditions. So I'd encourage you to go down and see those blokes that have got both the yield data stuff and the price stuff there. We can also use modelling to help in that form guide. And the last one that I've put up there, which is this one around the farmer results. If you've been working with a client for 10, 15 years and you've been collecting data, you've in fact got a fantastic form guide there. And you want to be using that form guide to help in framing those odds. The reason why I've touched on risk, because one of the most important things when people make a decision and what they see as perceiving a decision to be hard is understanding the potential loss in a decision. And I'll come back to this a bit because it ties in, I think, with the weed control work. I've only got 5 minutes. All right. Yeah, so if things go wrong, that's where you've got some decisions are hard. And because of that, if you want to actually invoke some response in someone, talk about the potential losses, because loss is really powerful. Okay, last bit I'll finish off on it, people and the personalities, okay, which is what I call this hard stuff. I've got there, while profits drive business, life's not all about profit. Okay, and the number of farmers I talk to, there's this thing about lifestyle and the other things that they want to get out of it. And so we're actually talking about the heart, or the values, the goals and the things that they wish to achieve. Might actually skip over this one around the goals, but everybody's got goals. It's the last point that I want to touch on. we're really poor at understanding and sharing goals in farming businesses. And if anybody's ever done succession planning and you sit around the table with a group of people of different generations and you start talking about where do you want to be in the future, you find they've all got these different objectives of what they're trying to get out of the farming business. Never shared, never talked about it. First time they talk about it is when we do succession planning, okay? And if we'd understood that beforehand, you'd actually know what people are trying to get out of their business. This one I'll touch on because this is around the loss one. Loss is heavily tied to emotion, okay? And our decisions are tied to our emotion. And often we later justify them with logical reasons. So we make a what you might call an illogical, an emotional decision. I want that new green header. I don't really need that new green header, but I've bought it. Then I'll try and justify why I've done it. Okay, oh, it'll make the work quicker and it'll do this and it'll do that. Okay, but there's a lot of stuff around emotion when we make decisions. And the one important with loss is that we go out of our way to avoid a loss because of the way it makes us feel. Okay, and this is why loss and understanding loss is so powerful. It's probably best, I reckon, this thing encapsulated by a fellow by Daniel Kahneman. I don't know if anybody's followed his stuff. He's a Nobel laureate, works at Princeton University, he's a scholar there. And he says the pain of loss is twice as great as the pleasure of gain. So in other words, if you lose $1,000, you've got to make at least $2,000 before that'll erase that feeling of loss. So loss is an incredibly powerful emotion that will drive decision making. And I reckon if I think back to the weed one, I would be looking at what's the potential loss that we lose in our business as a key driver, as a key motivator to get people to start to take it seriously. Stress. Stress can be good or bad. Okay. Issue with long-term stress is that it's got a lasting effect on the decisions we make, and in particular makes you more conservative, far more conservative. And we've seen people, and there have been studies done when people come out of drought and they've gone through this really stressful period, that when they're finished at the end, they're far more conservative in their decision making for a good number of years afterwards. So take-home message, if you've had clients that have gone through a long period of stress, then expect them to be far more conservative in their decision making and what they'll like to take on. It ain't business as usual. And the last one, personality and temperament. Everybody's got a personality, everybody's got a temperament that drives their decision making. Now about 40% of your personality and your temperament is genetic, you're born with it. About 40% of it is what I'll call formative, okay? And that formative period is up to about 14 years old. When you're born to about 14 years old, okay? Really important if we start thinking about how people perceive agriculture, because a lot of that understanding and where they position it comes when they're in that younger phase. And about 20% of it's social. Now there are lots of different types of studies on this. Some people may have heard a thing called Myers-Briggs, which is a personality typing. Just want to touch on some work that was done by a fellow named Rod Strawn. He was a psychologist and he worked on this stuff for about 25, 30 years. And just contrast where farmers fit compared to the Australian population. And we've sort of grouped these into 4 broad temperament groups. And I've described them in the notes. There's a table in the notes which goes into more detail about these. And the 4 groups I've called the dependables. And they're basically at least half the farming population. They're people that love farming. They love hands-on stuff. They love doing things. They take pride in growing stuff. Okay, that's where they get their kicks. They love doing that sort of thing. And a group that's similar to that called the doers. Again, like to get out and do stuff. They tend to be a little bit more of risk takers. Tend to get jobs done on time, good under a crisis. Okay? So the majority fit into that, and you compare that to the Australian population, and so farmers are different in temperament type to the rest of the Australian population. So if you hear people saying farmers are a unique breed, they actually are. Okay, they have a different personality type, that's why they like going farming, that's why they like to do this sort of stuff. About 15% are what I call the pioneers, so they're the real sort of innovators, take a risk, take a punt, get bored of doing the routine and mundane, always want to go and see the next thing, what's the next thing that's coming up that I can have a go at. And the last group is what I'll call the team builders, that are about 5% of the population. They're the ones that like working in teams, like working in small businesses, and help everybody in that small business to realise their potential. Okay? They're about 5% of the typical farming population compared to about 25% in Australia. 2 key things out of that. If you go up the dependables and the doers, that's about 80%. 4 out of 5 farmers like doing farming. Don't like working on the business, like working in the business. Okay, and we keep saying, oh, you get more strategic, you've got to do this and that. Personality type doesn't want them to do that. They want to actually do the stuff. Okay, and 1 in 20 are team builders. And you think we've got, what, 35,000 farming businesses around the country, usually small businesses. 1 in 20 are naturally averse to wanting to be a team leader and to run that team and run that business. So I reckon there are some issues there that when we start to think about the advice we give, how that fits in. So, what's it mean? Different personalities means that they're good at different things and not at others. Okay, so they're good at some stuff, not at others. They like doing different tasks in their farming business. They like to be communicated in different ways, and the notes talk about that. And they like to adopt technology and practices differently. And I reckon I've got to a stage now where I can meet any farmer and I can start to think about their personality and think, click, 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 this is the way I need to approach it, this is the way I need to communicate with them, these are where the gaps might be in this business, and talk about who else potentially can I bring in to do that sort of stuff or to get them to learn to behave differently. In a lot of cases, they don't want to behave differently, they like doing what they're doing, so we've got to get someone else to fill that gap. So, take-home messages. Don't assume people know how to make good decisions. Just because we make them all the time doesn't mean we make good ones. Okay, there is a real process that's got to go behind decision making. Secondly, for the audience out there, become skilled at recognising what is influencing you and what's influencing your clients' decisions. So things like, just understand this head, heart, gut. It is not all about logical stuff. It's equally about head and gut. And a lot of decisions we've got to make are complex decisions, which means the head and the gut actually has more influence. The logical has less. I don't care about how good your argument is, I'm just not going to do it. And I'm sure everybody will have experienced that sort of thing. Think about this idea about rules of thumb and intuition. Think about risk and this idea about framing the odds, because part of decision making is around risk. And think about this personality side of it, the beliefs, the values and goals, and how the person you're working with, how does their personality shape the way they're going to react to the message you're trying to get out? And I'll finish on that. Other people have helped put this sort of stuff together, and that's their acknowledgements there. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, James.